So it seems that we can put a fair few of the pieces together and take a look at the core of the rules for 10th edition 40k. Let's talk through all the details of the info from the big rules leak and the many changes it's going to bring to the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking 10th edition core rules once more, and as a follow-up to the video earlier in the day, we're now going to delve into the depths of the leak, talk through every single rules change that we can find in the core rules of 10th edition, and look at all the subtle changes as well as the big ones that we talked about earlier. As I'm sure most of you will be well aware by now, it seems that earlier in the day the core rules for Leviathan have escaped to the internet, widely circulated and discussed across lots of Reddit, Facebook and Discord servers. Basically photos from someone who's got the actual copy of the Leviathan book. Very clear full fat pictures these ones, there's absolutely zero chance that these are fake. I was wondering if Games Workshop might do one of their usual things and try and preempt the leaks by circulating the actual full download themselves, but it seems that they've chosen not to, at least so far. So while we wait for them to release the full rules, let's talk about what we've got, though I'm sure it'll be along in their free download in not so very long. After properly having a chance to look through all of this, it turns out that the leak isn't an entirely full leak of the core rules, though it does appear to be the vast majority of the actual core game mechanics of 40k, there's just a fair bit of peripheral stuff left off. The main thing that we've got is a talk through all the phases in detail, the way that moving, shooting, fighting and the command phase work, plus some of the really helpful lists of rules, things like the weapon keywords, the stratagems, and some rule sections devoted to strategic reserves and leaders. There is quite a lot of stuff missing from this though. There's going to be some special rule sections for transports for definite, maybe things like aircraft and fortifications as well. None of those special classes are listed here. Perhaps one of the most major sections that we're missing is all the terrain rules. We have a general gist of what's going to happen with them from Games Workshop's previews, but we still need to see some fine print on things like infantry interactions with ruins. It seems that a page of basic definitions has been left off, so we don't know if engagement range has changed massively in 10th edition, though my instincts are it's almost certainly kept the same. And it also doesn't have anything for the missions and army construction rules, though I suspect there'll be a fairly brief page of the book. Army construction is super simple, and the mission in the book is a really basic one. Still though, even with all those bits left off, there's a whole ton of details here, a bunch of answers to the gaps that we had in our knowledge from 10th so far. Let's go through the reveals then, and we'll start out with a few basic definitions, and then go through the turn sequence in order. From a page of definitions, we've got a little bit about 40k and dice rolling. Seems like the core mechanics of the game are still intended to roll one dice after another, though they do have a section on fast dice rolling, which in reality is the way that most people tend to play it. This one's definitely not a particularly intuitive thing to newer players when you might have to slow roll and fast roll. It can be kind of important for command points and things. They also do define things like starting strength, half strength, and how to units with attached characters work with all that. These are quite important to a few game mechanics, both on the datasheets, but also particularly to Battle Shock. It seems that to be below half strength for Battle Shock and things, it looks like your multi-wound models must have less than half their wounds remaining, and your units of models must have less than half their models remaining, so that'll be say 4 Space Marines out of a 10-man squad, and that's below half strength. Kind of implied just by the words themselves, to be honest, but good to underline no confusion for whether or not 5 Space Marines counts for that. Attached units are the ones with leaders that we'll get onto in a second. While they're attached, they basically raise the starting strength by 1 or by however many models in the leader's unit. Apparently though, if either the leader or the rest of the squad is destroyed, then from then on you just take it as the leader or the squad was at their starting strength. So say if you had a Space Marine captain and he had his entire squad shot away but he didn't take any wounds, that captain wouldn't count as below half strength. He'd only count for that if he had less than half of his own wounds remaining after that. In any case though, a few definitions aside, let's get into the actual turn. From other previews, we know that the game is still going to be 5 turns normally, 5 battle rounds in which each player has one of their turns each, and you progress through the 5 stages, command phase through to fight phase. Compared with 9th edition, morale has been rolled into the command phase as a battle shock sub-phase, and the psychic phase is kind of scattered to the winds. The core mechanics are gone, and the other rules are tied in with command, movement, shooting and charge phases, whenever the actual psychic powers are going to take effect. In reality, there's a little bit more complexity than this. The command phase has the command abilities and then the battle shock. In the movement phase, you move your units and then you bring on reinforcements. And the fight phase, again, is kind of broken down into 2 halves. Fights first units and then all the rest of them. Still though, fairly intuitive and just a little bit streamlined from where it was before. Starting with the command phase, that's broken down into 2 sections. The first bit's where you do your command abilities, the very start of the command phase, both players gain a CP, usable for the stratagems in the armies and the ones in the core book that we'll get onto later. And then most of the meat of the command phase happens next. You get to choose which other abilities you have to play in the command phase, whether they're stratagems or datasheet buffs, and you get to use those in an order of your choosing. Then we basically have the Battle Shock phase, which is where the morale phase is hiding really. There are plenty of other ways to hand out Battle Shock, but the primary mechanic is that for each of your units that are less than half strength, you roll 2d6 versus leadership, often something like a 6 plus or a 7 plus. You might have around about 20 to 40% chance to fail, and if you roll lower than that, then you're battle shocked. Your unit becomes objective control 0, so you can't hold objectives at all. You need at least 1 point worth of objective control to stand on any objectives, it seems. If your unit falls back, then it needs to test Desperate Escape for each model that does so. Again, we'll get onto that in the movement phase, but you basically lose some models, and then the controlling player can't use any stratagems besides Insane Bravery on that unit. A trio of very nasty debuffs there, but maybe doesn't actually hurt the unit's raw damage and defense for the most part. It's mainly kind of peripheral stuff if you're just not getting stuck into the enemy. Still going to be very meaningful though, particularly objective control for scoring points. Then we've got the movement phase. As with 9th edition, you've got 4 different options for each of your units here. You can either choose to make a normal move and just move up to their normal movement characteristic, normal stipulations of not ending in engagement range of enemy units. You can elect to make an advance roll for an extra d6-inch movement at the cost of shooting and charging normally, but some rules can allow you to do so. You can choose to remain stationary, which might be helpful for some things like heavy weapons, and also it's what you have to do if you want to remain in combat and not fall back. And then if you do find yourself overrun with the enemy in melee, you can choose to fall back, basically make a normal move out of engagement range. You can't shoot or charge after, and as mentioned, you might well be triggering the Desperate Escape rules. If you're battle shocked, then everything in the unit gets it. If you're surrounded, then you might trigger it as well, and we'll get onto that in just a second. In my opinion though, the single biggest change to the move phase is that you basically get to ghost through friendly models now. Your miniatures, even the ones without fly, can basically move normally through friendly models but not through enemy ones, and that is going to be quite nice for positioning. It means that your units won't be tripping over themselves now and say having a squad need to move around a squad or have the first squad move out the way. It will be a bit easier for units to advance in formation and things, and I feel like that's quite a good idea. Definitely chips away at an annoying bit of micromanaging that felt a bit abstract in the first place. The only exception to that, though, is that monsters and vehicles can't move through or over other monsters and vehicles, so it does mean that things like rhino tanks in convoy might well be getting in the way of each other. You'd have to think a bit more carefully about the positioning of those, and they could still get in the way of each other. Overall, though, I do like that change. I think it's a good thing. While we don't have the full terrain rules yet, and that will be really helpful to see for the movement phase, they did clarify a little bit of terrain in the movement section. Basically, your models get to ignore any terrain features that are less than 2 inches of height for moving over them, so that might be quite handy for just basically ignoring barricades and pretending that they're not there. But otherwise, if you've got obstacles that you need to move through or climb, you do have to actually measure the distance to go up them vertically, then down the other side. Currently in 9th edition, infantry can basically ghost through ruined walls and things to represent them using doors and windows. We don't have final confirmation that that's staying yet, but my guess will be that it probably is at the moment until we hear otherwise, and it's probably things like mounted units, monsters, and vehicles that would have to move around terrain fully. As you'd probably expect, you can't end your move mid-climb, as you wouldn't have anywhere to stand on. You have to complete the move, otherwise you just won't be able to make that climb. There is an interesting change to flying units as well. As before, these guys get to move through friendly and enemy models of any kind, and that can help them avoid desperate breakout as well. The change for fly units, though, is that previously you basically just measured horizontal distance for them, and they just completely ignored vertical distance going up and down over terrain. It now seems though that you do actually have to measure the vertical distance, so basically say if you had a winged prime that was on the ground floor and it was going up to a mid-floor on the next building or something, it would be moving diagonally and you'd measure it as such. To me this seems reasonable enough, to be honest. I feel like it's how quite a lot of people just generally tended to play it anyway, just through instinct. Though it does mean that certain flying units could actually have terrain impact them really quite a lot more now. Say if you had a great big flying winged monstrous creature and it came up against a really massive ruined wall, it wouldn't just be able to hop over it with impunity unless it gets something else from the terrain rules section. Overall, maybe a little bit of a nerf to flying models. I guess flying infantry models might have it a bit easier if they retain the ghost through ruined walls thing. Talking of Desperate Escape earlier, this is basically the evolution of the Desperate Breakout stratagem, the one that was originally made to allow you to escape being surrounded or tri-pointed. This one allows you to fall back through enemy models for free if desired. You no longer have to pay command points, though to be fair it's not exactly free, as you have to pay a price and risk for the miniatures that choose to do so. Basically, say if your units got surrounded entirely by a big mob of orc boys and you desperately needed to get the last 2 miniatures out of there, you could then elect to make this kind of move. They get to move straight through the enemy, though each miniature that needs to actually make the move through enemy models rolls a dice, and if you roll a 1 or 2, then you lose one model in the unit. I don't think it actually has to be the one that was trying to make the run through the mob, so I guess that's good news if you get your sergeants surrounded. On the other hand though, if your squad is battle shocked and then you need to fall back, literally every model in the unit has to take the test, though it seems that you never need to take it multiple times though, say if you were both surrounded and battle shocked, which would seem like quite a bad situation. Overall I quite like this, really quite punchy, and it does give you a high price to pay if you're running away while broken morale. Plus it could actually be the best thing to do if you just need that extra bit of positioning to get you towards an objective or something. Occasionally it might well be worth losing some models to get more victory points. Then basically at the end of the move phase you get the reinforcement phase. As in 9th edition this is done after you've moved all your units. This is where your units come down from deep strike or outflanking at the edge of the board. As with 9th edition it still doesn't seem like there's any core rules restriction as to when reinforcements can arrive in terms of battle rounds, but this might well still be present in the mission rules as it is currently, and that does confuse quite a few people. As per normal though, they say that if reinforcements don't arrive by the end of the game, they're destroyed, and so far I believe that we've only had the 2 mechanics for reserves arriving to the table, either Deep Strike or Strategic Reserve. The Deep Strike rules listed here are basically set up anywhere on the table that's 9 inches horizontally away from enemy troops. It seems at least with the core Deep Strike rules that it doesn't specify anything about this being in Battle Round 2+ or anything like that. If there's not more restrictions in the missions and things, it might mean that you can literally Deep Strike turn 1, and the game can actually start with something like a whole bunch of Terminators teleporting into the battle. Strategic Reserves on the other hand will go through next. They arrive in a very similar way to Deep Strike, but they have restrictions on where you can have them turn up on the board. Plus on this one you do have restrictions as to which battle round they can turn up on. I guess if you're trying to charge out of Deep Strike, then the defender taking up positions in high ruins could actually be kind of interesting to deny charges. Might well not be worth it for other reasons though, and I feel like you wouldn't be able to cover a whole army like that. When they come down on the board, the arriving units count as making a normal move, so as per now I guess that would still be a downside for heavy weapons and things. Talking of strategic reserves, we do have the full breakdown as to how they work in 10th, maybe not too enormously differently from how they worked before, but the changes are still interesting. Unlike in 9th edition, at least outside Arcs of Omen, they now no longer cost any CP whatsoever. You get to put your units into reserve for free, but you can only do so with up to 25% of your points limit, so that'd be 250 points at Incursion, 500 at Strike Force, and 750 at Onslaught. Means that with strategic reserves alone, you're not going to have your entire army starting off the board, though it still seems that with things like Deep Strike, that's not limited anywhere near as much. The way that they arrive from the board is they can turn up within 6 inches of any board edge. As with Deep Strike, they can't arrive 9 inch horizontally from enemies, and the thing where you got to turn up in your own deployment zone and potentially turn up very very close to enemy troops, that's entirely gone from 9th. In terms of the round restrictions, like now you can't arrive in battle round 1, but you can arrive in the second battle round, and the only restriction on that is that you have to arrive outside of the enemy deployment zone, you can't arrive inside it, and then on the third battle round and later, you can then arrive from any board edge on the table. There's no longer any stipulation that you can't arrive from your opponent's board edge. That was something that was previously banned in 9th. Overall seems pretty solid to me. I'd guess they'll have a similar sort of feel in 10th to how they do in 9th. Pretty tempting to have 1 or 2 units start out like this. Maybe damage dealers that are sort of medium range and kind of slow, like Space Marine Eradicators for example, but probably not over-invest in going into strategic reserves, as then you'll have too little to contest the mid-board in the early game, and your opponent will be doubly rewarded for screening things out. Moving on into the shooting phase, and the core of the phase maybe hasn't changed enormously. The core of the phase works pretty similarly, but there are a fair few more universal special rules here, both in terms of damage and defense. As before, you get to select a unit to shoot, not one that either advanced, fell back, or is in combat normally. You then pick your targets. You can't shoot enemies with the lone operative keyword unless they're within 12 inches, so that's things like assassins and some characters. You can't target enemy units in engagement range unless they're monsters or vehicles, which we'll get onto with big guns never tire, and you can fire all ranged weapons that your unit has, divide them among different targets if you like, but you can't split the individual shots of one weapon between 2 different targets. Taking damage does work very similarly to 9th as well. The unit shooting attacks are basically all resolved simultaneously, though you only actually roll one weapon profile at a time. It means, for example, if you shot at a fire warrior squad and there was only one visible, you could still fire with all your weapons, even if the opponent removed that model first. There were a few rumours based on Games Workshop's previews that you might only be able to shoot what you can see at the moment. I didn't think that was particularly likely myself, and it does turn out that was all conjecture. If the opponent does have one model in a squad exposed, you can potentially unload an entire squad shooting into it, and they can take casualties on the other models in the unit. Then we've got the damage sequence that is kind of the core mechanics of Warhammer 40k. There's a few interesting changes here, but again it broadly remains the same. The hit rolls are now listed on weapon profiles themselves rather than on the target's base stat line. Unmodified hit rolls of a 6 now count as a critical hit, and they can sometimes trigger other rules. They'll always succeed and ones will always fail, and you still can't modify hit rolls and things more than +1 or -1, the same as now. Seems that my guess for the stealth rule was accurate. It looks like it is a -1 to hit at range. Some units get a -1 to hit at range and melee, so that's listed differently if they get that. The wound rolls have the same system as they do currently, a 2+ if you're twice the opponent's toughness, a 3+ if you're just greater than it, a 4+ if you equal it, and so on. Ones will still always fail, and again you can't modify the wound roll more than a +1 or a -1. Again we've got the definition for critical wounds as well. That might matter for some datasheet abilities, and also matters for the devastating wounds weapon keyword. As mentioned, when allocating attacks, you can still do that to models out of line of sight provided at least something in their unit can be seen. And if you happen to be targeting a unit with an attached character, the squad has to take damage before the leaders normally, and if there's already a model in the squad that's already taken wounds, then you have to start saving on that one first. Then finally we get to saving throws, which have the same sort of system as they do now. You basically have your saving throw that's based on your datasheet. That gets modified by AP, and you might have some other positive modifiers, such as having the benefit of cover, which gives you a +1 to your save. Interestingly, probably the biggest change out of this is that the saving throw can never be improved by more than a +1 modifier, though it can be taken down to worse than that if you've got a very high AP. The way that this is worded, I believe that this applies after AP has been counted, so I guess it prevents a 5+ save unit ever saving on a 3+, for example, but I believe that that 5+ save unit could still get a +2 to its save, provided it cancelled out with a -2 AP or something, so I feel like it's probably a rule that isn't going to come up all that much. It does seem invul saves are basically still a thing and work as before, basically an alternate save that you can take instead of your saving throw, unmodifiable, and it seems that it's a game tenet that only mortal wounds tend to ignore these now. A lot of models that used to ignore it on their datasheets have had that rule removed. Overall I'd say nothing too groundbreaking here, just a few tweaks. Perhaps a bit more interesting are a few of the rules around taking damage, a fair few things that have been consolidated into the main book. As mentioned, the stealth rule will give you a -1 to hit at range only, not in melee, and unlike some previous versions of the rule like with Raven Guard or Alpha Legion, there's no range requirement on this. You could be right next to the model that's got stealth, and he's still going to be -1 to hit them. Going to be a rule that's going to be a little bit more effective against ballistic skill 4+ armies versus 3+ ones. Next up, we've got the benefit of cover for a +1 to your saving throw. That's going to be one of the most common ways that the saves get modified, I suppose, though it does have that proviso that you specifically can't go from save 3+ to save 2+ against AP0 weapons, a little bit less effective for things like Space Marines and Sisters taking damage against light guns. Mortal wounds are still here, and it still looks like they're the same as they were before. Basically dangerous damage that can go straight through invul saves, doesn't have to wound normally, and unlike most normal damage characteristics, their wounds can overflow to the next model. As before, it seems like Feel No Pain type saves can still be used against them, now officially called Feel No Pain again. It does seem that the general trends on the previews so far, though, have been slightly fewer mortal wounds throughout 10th edition. They're still there on quite a lot of stratagems and special rules and things, but maybe not quite so many armies actually rely on them as a core damage mechanic. It looks like things like Psychic is going to more regular shooting attack profiles, as opposed to just being pure mortal wounds. Then we've got Feel No Pain, which is the chance to ignore wounds, much the same as it is in 8th and 9th, though now it's not known by a million different names, it's just got the one. Again, this mechanic's pretty much unchanged, just consolidated under one banner. It's listed as an X+ sort of saving throw that you get to take after your regular saves, and as before, if you happen to have two different versions of it, then you only get to use one, even if you have multiple. Looks like it doesn't seem to be particularly common to most factions across the game. I feel like it's normally going to be one that you get for medics and things. We have seen it on that Leagues of Votan medic in the Hearthkin squad. I'd guess things like apothecaries and plague surgeons and friends, they'll be able to hand it out. Otherwise, it doesn't look like they've got any core ways to negate it. Previously, it wouldn't work against weapons that would double its toughness in editions past, but nothing going on like that here. Finally, for a common rule on datasheets that triggers when you die, there's deadly demise. This one's the standard issue vehicle explosion rule. If your vehicle dies and you roll a 6 for the explode, then any units within 6 inches take some mortal wounds, varying depending on how big the vehicle is. As before, big explosions remain very cool, ideally in the heart of your opponent's army as opposed to in the middle of yours though. Next up, we've got big guns never tire, which is perhaps one of the most debated rules out of the book. I might cover this in its own short video, as it seems to be there's some debate on the rule. My personal reading on it is that it's genuinely ambiguous and could probably do with an FAQ, as I've seen plenty of people on the internet argue it one way or the other. In 9th edition, it was basically the rule for vehicles and monsters firing into combat against things that they were engaged with, but now it looks like there's a bit more scope for other shooting getting involved outside of just the ones that are locked up. In terms of the very clear-cut stuff that's not debated, basically vehicles and monsters when they're in combat can still be shot by other units, it seems that these big things are big enough to be able to pick out even in the heat of the fight. If you take a pot shot at, say, a vehicle that's in combat with your own troops across the board, you're normally going to take a -1 to hit penalty on your attacks unless they're made by pistols. Though interestingly enough, the actual unit that they're tying up can't actually shoot at the same vehicle, besides with pistol weapons with the actual pistol special rule. Basically, enemy vehicles and monsters can't hide in combat with your own troops, you'll still be able to shoot at them with a -1 to hit. The other bit that's fairly obvious is that vehicles and monsters still have the rule for shooting at units within engagement range for them. They take a -1 to hit on most weapons now, not just heavy ones, it's only pistols that get to ignore that modifier. The bit I've seen debated though, and I think is genuinely a bit ambiguous, is whether or not vehicles and monsters in engagement range can actually just ignore the units that they're engaged with and go shooting at other things. If so, they'd take that same -1 to hit penalty besides against pistols and things, and the question is whether or not they can fire out of combat. The full text for the rule has two different sentences, the first one saying that they can be chosen to shoot, and the second one saying that they can choose to shoot a target that they're in engagement range with. By my reading, the way that they say can but not must kind of implies that you can opt to do that, but you can also opt not to. Though I do admit from the way it's worded, it's kind of implied that you're supposed to. On the other hand, the summary bullet point thing that you can see on the top right, that simply says that vehicles and monsters can shoot and be shot at even when they're in engagement range of enemy units, and when they do they take -1s to hit. There's certainly nothing there that says that they must target the unit that they're in engagement range with, which would be kind of weird to miss off even on a summary. Like I say, I've seen people come up with both conclusions there. I'd probably argue that rules as written they can fire out of combat by these two, but I feel like if that was the intention of Games Workshop they haven't really made it super clear, and it could be helpful to have a bit more clarification. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes down in the comments below. Next up, while we're on shooting attacks though, we now have the full roster of weapon abilities in the game. These ones are being kind of drip fed out to us with more and more small reveals for them, and actually getting the full list maybe didn't add as much as you might have expected. It seems that we had seen at least the majority of them. Going down the list, assault weapons now get to advance and shoot with the weapon that they have. There's no penalty to doing so, but it does look like it's a fairly rare weapon class now. Lots of weapons just don't have any keywords whatsoever and operate kind of simply compared with 9th edition. Rapid fire's kind of similar, X extra shots at half range, so you can vary that up a bit, but most of the time it still seems to be double. Pistol weapons are good for firing in engagement range. It does remain either or with firing your pistol weapons or the rest of them, so no blazing away with your standard bolt pistol as well as, say, your bolt rifle. The torrent rule is auto hitting for flamers, nothing else fancy going on there, though on flame weapons it often seems to be paired with ignores cover. Again, nice and straightforward there, the target never gets that benefit of cover to its saving throw. The twin links rule is re-roll the wound roll, and the trade-off for that has been getting half the amount of attacks that they would have got in 9th edition, generally a bit of a nerf, but it doesn't seem to apply to all twin linked weapons. Things like las cannons just get 2 shots, and they don't have the twin linked keyword at all. Lethal hits is where the 6s to hit auto wound. It seems that this one does not count as a critical wound, thankfully. I feel like that might have been a bit dodgy if it interacted with things like devastating wounds. Maybe Games Workshop learned a lesson there from the Leagues of Votann and the problems that caused. It seems there's a lance keyword for things like the Adeptus Custodius Virtus Praetors and maybe the Guard Rough Riders. That one gives you a +1 to wound when you charge in. Kind of interesting that lance now just applies to cavalry lances and not things like bright lances and dark lances that have had extra rules in the past. Indirect fire is your artillery rule. You get to fire out of line of sight, but if you choose to do so, then you get -1 to hit, and the unit that you're targeting also gets the benefit of cover as well, which means unless they already had cover already, then you're going to be worsening your AP. Basically gives you some incentive to get direct line of sight with those units if you can, and puts your barrage weapons at a bit of a premium if you can't. Finally, for the first half, the precision keyword is your character sniping one. If you target a unit with a leader in it, and that leader is visible to the unit attacking, any attacks made with the precision keyword can be used to assign to the leader rather than the squad, so potentially has the ability to snipe characters out of units even before you've killed their bodyguards. This one doesn't appear to allow you to snipe specials or heavies or things. That was one other application of sniper rifles in the past. It doesn't seem to interact with the lone operative keyword at all. So it seems like you wouldn't be sniping things like Tower Commander Shadow Sun with her stealth generators. We're only half done though, and there really are quite a lot of these weapon abilities. Maybe it's not the worst though to have a central list that covers the vast majority of things, and you maybe have a little bit less bloat on the datasheets and individual variations. The blast keyword got changed in 10th edition. This one now gives you an extra attack with your blast weapon for every 5 models in the target unit. For things like D3 blast weapons, they're going to be absolutely brutal against 20 strong units. 4 extra attacks is pretty mad for them. Blast weapons are still not allowed to be fired in engagement range, even if you had a rule like the big guns never tire one. Melter is consolidated and pretty much the same as it was before, X extra damage within half range. Very nice if you can get up close with those guns. The heavy keyword also seems to be a lot more rare along with assault. It now gives you +1 to the hit roll if you're stationary. For certain infantry-borne heavy weapons, it also seems to be paired with a worse ballistic skill than most. Say for example, a Space Marine with a heavy weapon might be hitting on a 4+, unless you remain stationary, when he goes back up to a 3. The hazardous keyword is the new interpretation of plasma weapons. This one's quite a nice change I think, and it basically means that you get to make your attacks, and then after you've made your attacks you roll 1 single dice for a hazardous weapon check. On a 2+ your model is fine, but on a 1 it either is outright slain if it was part of a squad, or if it was a character monster or vehicle, it instead takes 3 mortal wounds. Kinda good that this no longer has issues with numbers of shots. Things like assault hellblasters aren't going to be cooking themselves all the time now, but I feel like for certain weaker plasma weapons like a plasma pistol, you're probably rarely going to want to overcharge that on a character. You might well be averaging just as much damage to your own valuable character as you do in terms of extra damage to the enemy. It also means that things like reroll ones to hit will no longer protect you against plasma weapons overcharging, maybe not the worst thing in the world. Devastating wounds is the one where wound rolls of a 6 or critical wounds, they deal mortal wounds to the enemy instead of the regular damage characteristic of their attack, and then the attack sequence ends after that. Means that they're quite general purpose, though they're never going to be particularly reliable unless you've got an easier way of making them get critical wounds. One way that you could get critical wounds a bit more easily is being paired with the anti-keyword. That one allows wound rolls of X+ to auto-wound with a critical wound. We've seen the pairing of that with devastating wounds on the anti-vehicle arc rifle for the AdMech. Means that on a 4+ against tanks and things, they'll deal the damage as mortal wounds, which is really quite potent. That keyword's also popped up on things like Chain Fists, auto-wounding vehicles on a 3+, or things like the Death Guard's Plague Flamer that auto-wounds infantry on a 2. Extra attacks is the rule that gets you additional attacks with a weapon in combat. Normally you just select one weapon, but this means that you can also fight with this weapon as well. Sounds like it's often going to be used for things like extra cavalry attacks, like Orc Squig's biting perhaps, and Cole has a fair few with his mecha dendrites and things. Finally, sustained hits is the one where you get X extra hits on critical hits. If you get your hit roll of a 6, then you might get 1 extra hit or D3 extra hits. Potentially really quite nice for anything with 4 rerolls to hit if you do have a high number there. Generally speaking though, that's going to be a fairly flat damage increase against most things that you could target. Overall, it does feel like a fairly all-encompassing list of keywords. Certainly covers a whole load of mechanics that were present in 9th edition. It is going to be interesting to see how Games Workshop applies them going forward. After we're done shooting though, we get to the charge phase, though admittedly you'll still be using plenty of those weapon keywords I guess in melee. In the charge and fight phase there have been a few fairly major tweaks to the way that 40k combat works. I feel like there's going to be a few mentality shifts compared with 9th edition. I say maybe the general theme of it is that charge and fight phase movement has got a lot more restrictive, and you're less able to do gamey things with it like gain extra movement or chain out to objectives. The way that charging works is that you still select a unit within 12 inches. You can't charge if you advanced fell back or if you're currently in combat as per now. And it seems that you can't normally charge aircraft as well, and there doesn't seem to be any exemption for things with the fly keyword, though admittedly if there is another section for aircraft, it's possible it might be there. The charge roll is still 2d6 inches, and in some ways it's very similar, in a few ways it will work a bit different. For the charge move, still to make it into a successful combat, you still only need to get into an engagement range. One of the pictures implies that it's still a 1-inch engagement range horizontally, I'd guess probably still the 5-inch vertically that we have at the moment, and if you can get into that 1-inch range, then you are still going to have a successful charge. However, the difference is now that if models can get into base contact, then you must do so. It means there's a bit less scope for just gamely just not quite making base contact, and then using things like pile-ins and consolidates to gain extra movement. Probably not the worst thing in the world to happen to be gaining a lot more positioning when you're busy fighting the enemy. In addition to that, even if you can't make base contact, all models in the squad must finish the move closer to the unit that they charged. Looks like there's just going to be a little bit less scope for doing weird charge movements to chain out to objectives, though depending on the positioning of the squad, it still might not be impossible. When you're moving your models, the controlling player selects the order in which they choose to move the models for this. I guess that could be relevant, as some models will physically block other models from being able to make base-to-base contact potentially. It could just matter for who's able to fight, or whether or not you're able to do some chaining mechanics. In addition to that, there's still the restrictions of retaining unit coherency and staying out of engagement range of things that you didn't elect to charge. There's a couple of other exceptions for other charge phase rules that are kind of similar to the movement ones. Terrain works very similarly, ignoring things that are less than 2 inches in height, and otherwise you need to go up and down terrain pieces. And fly models seem to work the same as they do in the movement phase now. They can move across other models, and they can move up and over terrain pieces, but now they need to measure that distance diagonally, as opposed to just measuring it flat. Then when you get to the fight phase, charging units get the fight first rule for the following engagements. When battle is joined, as with now, you basically progress through the units that are eligible to fight, activate with them, and make their blows against the enemy. The units that you can choose to activate are similar to now: any unit that's made a charge move, and any unit that's in engagement range, and as per now, charging will still be relevant due to things like piling and consolidation. Certainly a bit more restrictive, but still not gone. Unlike 9th edition, they've been quite helpful in breaking down the two different phases of how things fight. First up, everything with the fight's first rule starts, and then basically everyone else will be fighting after that, again alternating with you choosing one and your opponent choosing the other, and so forth. It does seem that fights last is probably gone entirely from 10th edition. That was something that was really quite a big deal in 9th. Looks like you're only really going to have the 2 phases of combat, rather than the 3 with the ones that fought first, then fought normally, then fought last. One small but very important change to the charge and fight phase is that when you start selecting units to fight, it seems that now you start with the player whose turn is not taking place rather than the one who is. This was previously the case for all the fights normally units, but previously the charging player usually got to pick the first charging unit to fight. Looks like any units that just have the fights first ability built into their datasheets will be pretty excellent at resisting charges. Seems that if you charge into a unit with fights first, under normal circumstances, the opposing player will have the opportunity to activate that fight's first unit before you get to fight, potentially beating you to the punch in a big way. Then though, you alternate between all the rest of the fight's first units until there's none left. Only after there's none left at all, then you move on to the fight's normally units. I believe that one would just follow on from being after whichever unit had just activated, so it would probably depend on which player fought last in the first step. Overall, it does look like that fight's first rule could be massively powerful. Pretty surprising that it looks like you beat charging units to the punch there. Then when you actually activate your units to fight, the way that you actually fight units in engagement has changed a bit. Pile-in still seems to be 3 inches towards the closest model, but now the change to that is that you must end in base contact if at all possible, and they also spell out that any units that are already in base contact, they can't pile in further. There's also been a small change to which models can actually activate to fight in the squad. First up, it's any models that are either in base contact or in engagement range of the enemy unit. My guess is that that's still going to be 1 inches, though we haven't seen the full rule officially. And then for fighting in the second rank, the rules have changed very slightly there. Previously it was within half an inch of half an inch. Now it's changed to any models in the second rank that are in base contact with your models that are in base contact with the enemy. Still means that you're basically fighting in 2 ranks, I suppose. Might just be a little bit more fiddly to get those models together. They really are going to have to bunch up quite a lot. Then when you've actually found the models that can engage, each model gets to choose just one of its melee weapons to make an attack with, but they do get to back that up with any extra weapons with the extra attacks rule. It's a very similar process to shooting. The attacks all effectively get resolved simultaneously, though you just go through one weapon profile at a time for the actual mechanics of rolling them. It just means that you can't kill models out of engagement range and let other models armed with different weapons in the same unit not get to fight. Then it looks like there's also been changes to Consolidate as well, which does seem to be a fair bit more restrictive than previously. You can still do the 3 inches within engagement range, and you must end closer to the closest enemy model in base contact if you can. And then if you happen to find yourself unengaged after the fight, maybe because you've killed the units that you've charged, if you elect to consolidate, you must either use it to move into an engagement range of another enemy unit, or only if you can't do that, you can use it to move 3 inches towards the nearest objective marker, provided the squad actually ends up in scoring range of it. If you're outside of combat and you can't meet either of those two conditions, the squad doesn't consolidate. Overall, I do feel like these restrictions on the charge and fight phase will mean that there's a little bit less movement to be gained in combat. It's going to be a lot more just directly piling into your enemy's units, and a lot less wiggling around the sides to try and gain extra movement. Overall, a good thing in my opinion. Next up, we've got the pages on the datasheets, and maybe nothing too surprising here. We've already seen quite a few of these in 10th edition now. They go through the way that most datasheets have got two sides. This army construction one here, where you get things like the weapon options that you can choose, how many models in the squad, and restrictions for things like leaders and transports and what units they can interact with. Plus you also get the keywords printed on both sides, things like the faction keyword to show which army that they're in, and other things that might be useful for other interactions, say infantry for interaction with terrain and stuff, or the grenades keyword to allow them access to that stratagem. Flipping it over to the in-game side, you've got the core stats across the top: movement value, toughness, saving throw, wounds characteristic, leadership characteristic of X+, and objective control, the numbers that you need to hold the points. Compared with 9th edition, they've moved the ballistic skill of weapons and the attacks numbers down to the actual weapon profiles themselves, and they've got the basic stats for going through the damage table, the range of how far they can affect the enemy units, how many attacks they get to make, and then their strength, AP, and damage for how much damage they can do to the foe. Then on the abilities section, you get any core rules from the big book, faction rules like the Space Marines Oath of Moment one from their army books, any special rules unique to the unit, and it seems that just about every datasheet in 40k has at least one, any invulnerable saving throws that they've got, and things like degrading rules for vehicles and Titanic units if they have them. Usually the general rule on that tends to be -1 to hit at a third wounds or less. Then we've got a whole bunch of special rules, things that might apply to certain datasheets, and then a bunch of stratagems. Leaders and characters has definitely been a big shake-up from 9th edition to 10th. Characters either become leaders or will usually have the lone operative keyword that we'll get onto in a second. For leader units, you attach these to your squads at the pre-game stage, and things like a Space Marine captain that have been elected to lead a squad, they must stay with that squad for the rest of the game. For restrictions as to what they can join, from the ones that we've had talked about by Games Workshop, it looks like they generally share the same armor class, so things like Terminators joining Terminators, and standard Primaris Lieutenants joining things like Intercessors or Blade Guard. And from then on, they basically count as one unit together, the character plus their bodyguard, called an attached unit. Under normal circumstances, you can only have one leader per unit, but it sounds like a fair few squads in 40k have a rule where you can have two. Things like the Sisters of Battle apparently have some, as well as Space Marines captains plus lieutenants. When you attack the units, you use the toughness of the bodyguards, not the character. And at least under normal circumstances, when you attack the units, all the attacks hit the bodyguards first rather than the character, unless you have that precision keyword, in which case you can hit the character first. It does mean that you could have the situation where the character's taken some wounds and another model in the squad had as well, and then it just depends on whether or not your opponent's using precision weapons as to whether or not the squad continues to take damage or the character does. Otherwise, it looks like there's no obvious ways to jump units, so one character going to one squad then the other, or to join a new squad when the bodyguard is killed. Might be a bit unfortunate for a Space Marine captain who's surrounded in a big phalanx of Space Marines or something. It sounds like there would be a bit of a focus on a character joining a unit that's kind of tough and hard to kill. Maybe something that's not too easily focused down and then just be able to shoot the character dead. In general, it seems like the characters give their buffs to the actual unit in question, as opposed to things like auras these days. The other version of character is the one called Lone Operatives. These are the characters that don't have the leader keyword and can't join squads, or are potentially leaders that can just opt not to join a squad and might be able to fulfill other criteria so they don't get directly shot too easily. The rule itself is very, very simple. If you have the lone operative rule, you can't be shot from greater than 12 inches away, but as soon as the enemy gets within that distance, you basically fair game. Even if you're hiding behind a shield wall of Terminators or something, if they can see you, then they can still shoot you. We've only seen some character datasheets so far, but not all of them, but it looks like some units just get lone operative permanently. I think this is generally going to be good for things that are famous stealth operatives, things like assassins perhaps. And then a whole bunch of commander type characters, they'll often get it with positioning requirements, say Gilliman near an Astartes infantry unit, or Belisarius Call near any AdMech thing, whether it's infantry or vehicle. Seems like it's fairly simple and effective compared with the previous lookouts, sir. A small mentality shift though in characters not being too hard to kill if you're up close. Next up, we've got 4 other special rules that maybe don't fit into other categories quite so neatly. Here's a couple of ones for deployment with Scouts and Infiltrators. The Scouts rule means that you move X inches at the start of the first battle round. This is your pre-game move from 8th and 9th edition. It basically counts as having made a normal move, and you must end the move greater than 9 inches from enemy models, though it seems that you can venture into the opponent's deployment zone if they've left it very empty and your unit has enough movement. There's a couple of interesting changes to this rule, in that the player with the first turn gets to move all of their units first. That does seem like really quite a major advantage to me. If you can take a whole bunch of the mid board before the enemy, that's going to be quite a nice positioning opportunity. And it also seems that the Scout special rule also confers the same rule to dedicated transports for that unit. Say for example, if you had a bunch of Sisters of Battle Dominions and then scouting forward in their Rhino. That rule was at least semi-common, I suppose. Kind of makes sense that it's baked in, I guess. The other one is the common forward deployment rule with Infiltrators. That means that you can just set up anywhere on the board greater than 9 inches from enemy models and the enemy deployment zone. Again, a really helpful one to have to seize the mid board and the objectives early. I think it's pretty handy to standardise these ones. They have been printed on quite a lot of datasheets in a very similar way. A couple of other keywords common to really quite a lot of abilities are auras and the psychic keyword. Auras are still very much alive and well as a thing in 10th edition, though a lot less common than before. As previously, they grant extra abilities to your units within 6 inches or might debuff enemies, and in general they're not so very different from the ones in 9th edition when they still exist. They've still got the rule where multiple copies of the exact same aura don't generally tend to stack, so Death Guard Gifts of Nurgle wouldn't give you repeated -1 to your toughness, for example. The model in question always counts as being in range of its own aura abilities, so characters are pretty much going back to being very good at buffing themselves, partly due to core just not being a thing in 10th edition anymore. Previously in 9th edition, that was to make auras a bit more targeted to certain units within the codex. It seems that Games Workshop have just dispensed with that altogether. Characters usually affect themselves with their own buffs. It seems a lot of scary stuff can affect some of the biggest guns in the game now, though I guess certain auras could still have things limiting their targets, say for example only affecting infantry. Otherwise, the psychic ability was quite an interesting one, appearing on a fair few datasheet abilities and weapon profiles. As I was suspecting, this one just seems to be a tag for other rules to key off. It doesn't do anything else in its own right. I think it would have been kind of hard to, with it listed on weapon profiles as well as passive buffs and things. There might be some rules that amp up certain psychic attacks, but I feel like the main rule is actually going to be psychic defense. Things like getting a feel no pain type save against psychic shooting, like we saw on the Space Marine Librarian, and Games Workshop previously hinted that certain rules would be able to interfere with psychic abilities. Say a Calexis Assassin or Sisters of Silence are probably going to mess with psychic abilities if they get really close to enemy units that have them. Overall, probably not going to be a super feels good thing for psychic abilities. I feel like the psychic keyword is probably going to be more of a weakness than it is a boon. Finally, we get to the 11 core stratagems of 10th edition, ones that I might decide to run through in another video all of their own now that we've got the full list, but just in brief, here are each of the stratagems and a few thoughts. For stratagems in general, it seems that for the most part you can still not use one stratagem in a phase multiple times most times, but there do seem to be a few datasheet abilities that allow you to do so, things like the Space Marine Captain. They also clarified that any regenerating mechanics for CP are capped at just 1 command point per turn, so even if you've got multiple different leaders that can all generate your command points, you're not going to regen any more than 1. Going through the list, we've got the grenade stratagem. This one is a bonus attack in the shooting phase that doesn't sacrifice any other models firing. For 1 CP, you get to throw a grenade at a unit within 8 inches. You roll 6d6 for that unit, and the target takes 1 mortal wound for each roll of a 4+. Overall, looks simple and pretty effective really. Extra damage there if you can spare the CP. Perhaps going to be most valuable for things like light infantry, just dealing a bit of a sting in the tail to a heavy vehicle that they want to try and kill. Maybe something with just a few wounds left. Tank shock seems kind of fun. That one's when you have one vehicle charging with no obvious stipulation about it not being walkers or anything like that. You select one of its attacks profiles and you roll 1d6 per pip of strength on that attack profile. Say for example a Rhino is 6 and a Baneblade is 8. In addition to those numbers, you also roll an extra 2d6 if the strength is higher than the enemy's toughness, just to add insult to injury. Then when you've rolled all those dice, for each 5+, you get 1 mortal wound up to a maximum of 6. Say for example for a Baneblade charging, you might expect something around 3 or 4 mortal wounds on most infantry. Again, that feels like quite a powerful little stratagem. Could be an interesting one for a tank just desperately trying to clear a few infantry off an objective or something, or roadkill a particularly valuable characters I suppose. Insane Bravery returns as a 1 command point one that you get to use when you've just failed a battle shock test. Kind of powerful that you get to see whether or not you've passed or failed before you get to choose it. Basically that unit just gets to count as passing the battle shock test rather than failing it. Could be really big if you have a unit fail on an objective or something, or a unit that's absolutely going to need to fall back and you don't want to take casualties on. This one definitely is quite a big boon against battle shock for armies that are going to be susceptible to it. Interesting that this one went down in command points and now can also be used multiple times per game. I feel like this one will be used quite a bit on objectives. For 1 CP, Epic Challenge has your hero try and kill another enemy one, and you trigger it when one of your characters is in engagement range of an enemy unit with an attached character. This one's nice and simple and doesn't really do anything in terms of challenges like it did in the past. Basically, your character just very simply gets the precision keyword on their attacks, so their attacks can directly hit the enemy character. I feel like this could definitely get used for a fighty character just sniping out a buffing character from a big squad. And I guess it could lead to some cinematic moments like your warlord killing the enemy one. Seems kind of fun and maybe just gives you a little bit more incentive to have your characters be melee capable. For 2CP, counter-offensive hasn't really changed all that much. 2 command points for your unit to fight next after the opponent's one has. Still going to be big if that means that you get to fight before the enemy does, if you can kill the enemy rather than the other way around. And finally the command reroll is still there. That seems to have gained another couple of targets. You can now use it for a desperate escape roll or a hazardous check. Could be extra nice if, say, you needed to protect a key character from that, maybe. Otherwise, it's fairly similar to how it was before. For the other half of the stratagems, we've got Rapid Ingress. That one was as previewed, basically reinforcements arriving in the enemy turn. They get to turn up in the enemy reinforcement phase, and it could give you some surprise extra weight to objectives, or maybe just set you up for a next turn charge if you can bring them down behind some cover. Takes a bit of setup, but could deliver a fighty melee units to the heart of the enemy army. Fire Overwatch has changed quite a lot for 1 CP. One of your units gets to attack with 6s to hit against an enemy unit within 24 inches, and now there's far more ways that you get to trigger this. You could trigger it at the start or end of any move, as a sort of intercept mechanic after the enemy reinforcement drops, or the start or end of an enemy charge. It's going to be particularly brutal on weapons that don't need to hit with that torrent keyword. Looks like you just probably couldn't afford to get anywhere near those Infernus Marines with their flamethrowers with light infantry of your own. In particular, this one looks quite painful for certain armies like Eldar, who might have really valuable but fragile units removed by the enemy before they get to strike. Go to Ground is a small durability buff for infantry. They get a 6+ invul save and the benefit of cover when the opponent targets them with a ranged attack. For higher save units, that's going to be helpful enough, I think. If it makes the difference between the squad living or the squad dying, then it's probably done its job. Probably not super high yield though, I think. Smokescreen I think potentially looks even more interesting for vehicles though. A vehicle with the smoke launcher keyword that gains cover and stealth versus shooting. A pretty powerful double debuff there. -1 to hits, and also a +1 to your save normally. That's a serious decrease in damage output for just 1 CP, particularly if you're using it on a really big tanky vehicle like a Land Raider. Finally, last but by no means least, Heroic Intervention is now a bit of a countercharge mechanic that's no longer locked to characters. After an enemy unit has finished its charge range within 6 inches of one of your units then gets to countercharge them. They still need to roll a 2d6 inches, which they can fail. They don't get the fight first benefit that you usually would for charging, but basically means that a big scary melee unit has the potential to protect a more fragile unit of yours in the battle line, and might mean that your opponent just can't afford to charge an easy target due to the potential of one of your units wading forward and just killing them. The only thing that it's locked out of is non-walker vehicles, but in general this one looks really quite nice, if a little bit pricey at 2 CP. So anyway, there we have it, 10th edition Warhammer 40k as we know it so far. Really quite a lot of big details and gaps filled in there, though we are still missing some fairly big sections with things like terrain, transports, and a few other definitions and things. Overall, I feel like the core rules do feel like they're pretty well tightly written. In quite a lot of the ways, they realise the same sort of things that 9th edition was able to, but with some slightly more streamlined mechanics and cutting out a bunch of extraneous stuff. Overall, I'd say the vast majority of the changes that they've made are really quite positive. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts though, particularly in context of all the faction previews that we've been seeing recently. Let me know what you make of Warhammer 40k 10th edition as we've seen it so far. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more discussion like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.